Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jan Hernik. I am editor-in-chief at the Warsaw Institute. Welcome to another episode of American Alert. And today, again, my guest, we host Professor David Jones, expert in the field of international relations, University of Warsaw. Welcome again to the Warsaw Institute program.
Thank you, Jan. Good afternoon.
Today we are going to talk about President Biden's administration's reaction to growing geopolitical challenges in the East. So we are going to start with the NATO summit because this is a very current thing right now. It's underway actually. And of course, it takes place in Madrid, and it is expected that this summit will be a breakthrough actually, because we know that, as we can also read in the press releases, the leaders are to adopt a new strategic concept that will include NATO's goals and tasks for the next decade. Also, it is expected that the summit will take position on the war in Ukraine, a new perception of Russia, or the position of China. So I wanted to ask you, how do you evaluate the summit so far?
Well, I think the summit is something that's valuable. I don't want to sound like the critics of Vice President Kamala Harris. Of course, it's valuable, but I think it's valuable in these times more than in peace times. That said, it's divided. There's no question about that. It's divided. Some of the NATO member state representatives are uh, aligned with the United States. Others are not really aligned with the United States. They wish that the United States would do something differently. That could be something more, or that could be something less. Okay, so I think that's part of the problem. The real issue, I think, that's going to happen in Madrid with the NATO members when they join there is to decide whether to hold the course steady, like steady on course with a ship, or whether to increase delivery of armaments and possibly to initiate delivery of personnel beyond the volunteers that have done so already in Ukraine. I think those are the big issues. To my understanding, the Biden administration is largely going to argue for steady on course. They believe that while the amounts of money that can be contributed can be more, and the amounts of materiel can be more, that they still do not want to risk a World War III by involving NATO troops, and especially by involving American troops on the ground. Now, that said, the new chief of Her Majesty's Royal General Staff of the United Kingdom has told his troops at the time of the change of command last week that he urges them to prepare for war in Europe, so that we can see that the General Staff of the United Kingdom seem to be inclined to believe that war is, if not inevitable, a very real contingency. And I believe the Biden administration believes the same thing, but wishes that would not occur and will not want to be the triggering mechanism to make it occur.
If he said that the war is going to come to Europe, do you think that he believes that Putin will actually be, let's call it like that, brave enough to attack NATO countries?
I don't think that I have no information that any of the NATO member states believes that Putin would deliberately attack a NATO country. But there are ways of making errors, and there are ways of capsizing a sailboat by sailing too close to the wind. And among other things, there we could have an accidental, quote, accidental rocket attack that would hit a place in Poland, for example, that could easily drag NATO into a war,
Mhm.
or we could have more and more of these abysmally horrible deeds by the Russian Federation, striking a crowded shopping mall, for example, as they did a few days ago, that would make it so that the member states of Europe might feel that now is the time to increase to include personnel. If we increase to include personnel, and any of those personnel were to become casualties of war, then probably NATO would want to take up the ante and and engage with the Russian Federation much more than it has already.
Coming back to the NATO summit in Madrid, we know that to the summit also some leaders from Asia and Oceania were invited, right? We speak
Hmm?
about Prime Minister of Australia, of New Zealand, also representatives of Japan or South Korea. I wanted to ask you because I believe this is the first time in history when something like this happens, or it's very rare, right?
It's
And
very
my
rare
question,
because
yes,
no, go ahead.
and my,
Well,
my
because
question is,
NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty. It's the
mhm,
North Atlantic Treaty.
yes,
And of course, it's hard to stretch Oceania or any part of the Pacific or really anything east of the Urals to include the Atlantic watershed. So we see a figurative NATO emerging.
yes, I completely agree. But the question is, can we consider this as a sign that even NATO, as you said, is rather it consists of countries gathered around this Atlantic Ocean? Is this a sign that they start to treat this Chinese growing economic or military expansion seriously?
I think is a sign that they're starting to treat a potential Chinese military expansion
Yes.
seriously. And that may account for the desire by the NATO members, because nothing happens without their desire to move eastward. I do not think that they would risk expanding NATO into the Pacific Rim area merely on economic challenges. We've had many economic challenges over the past decade, certainly since Xi Jinping took the presidency of China in 2012, and we have not acted that way. One of the reasons for this would be the uh, increase in dependency upon Australia and New Zealand from their positions in the in what you call, just accurately, Oceania, and China's expansion into Pacific islands that reasonably can be considered. I do not personally consider them, as I've said before, but could be considered to be threats against Australia, particularly in New Zealand.
Refers to the interview which was made for the latest the Warsaw Institute Review Quarterly, which I highly recommend you to read. And coming back to the policy, foreign policy of the Biden administration in the East, as our title says today, we have, of course, Russian Federation and China. These are like two topics we are going to discuss today. And the first one, Russia. How do you assess the Biden administration response to the war in Ukraine, to this Russian aggression to Ukraine? Do you think or do you feel that it is good answer in contrary to this first event of Biden administration and Afghanistan evacuation, which was considered by many experts as a failure?
Well, I I will not fault President Biden at this juncture for not doing more for Ukraine. Remember, President Biden has the right wing of the Republican Party that he has to be careful he doesn't anger excessively. And the right wing, as we know from Laura Engel, for example, and the Engel this past week, has said that it's time to cut bait with Ukraine. I vehemently disagree with that. Vehemently disagree with cutting bait with Ukraine. But Biden has that to worry about. And now, most recently, the Democratic Party seems to want to abandon him in favor of Hillary Clinton for the 2024 presidential run. Remember, Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State in Barack Obama's first administration, wanted the policy to be a pivot to Asia. So I think that Biden now almost necessarily has to pivot to Asia to try to keep his popularity up. It's declining down into the 30% positive approval rate now, if not below that, with Democratic leaders. I believe that, in my opinion, he's done more or less the right thing. If one could fault him for anything responsibly, I would say that maybe he should have given more armaments to Ukraine. That's what they're saying earlier, followed the Trump administration's lead there, and maybe should have given some more armaments at an earlier point in time, and maybe urged the NATO members. Many were recalcitrant to give anything. Germany, for example, typically was recalcitrant to give anything. They've given some. But those are small arguments. I would say he wants to stay steady on course, and I would say right now that that's the right thing to do.
Mhm. And speaking about the Russian issue still, what is the future of Vladimir Putin?
Well, I understand that President Biden is very, very reluctant to approve, certainly not to authorize, and probably to approve any strike against Putin himself. There seem to have been some internal disagreements there. My guess is that the covert operatives of the United States and of NATO may be at work to make that happen. Former CIA operatives in the United States have said that if we did intervene and successfully removed Putin, that the Russian people would consider that to be untoward on our part. I think they're right. We don't go into countries and tear apart their leaders, and we certainly would not want them to do that to us, as I mentioned before in the last interview. The other side of that is that Putin is becoming erratic in many ways. What if in our own countries, in the United States, in Poland, for example, a terrorist, an individual non-state actor, were to attack a shopping mall, we would consider that to be a gross act of terrorism, and we would respond very, very vigorously. That's what
Yes.
Putin has done. That's what he's doing. He needs to go, but I cannot fault the Biden administration for not wanting to take him out ourselves.
Mhm. We have the first question from our chat. The question asked by also one of the Warsaw Institute experts, Michael Garbowski, who asks, is there a Ukraine fatigue in the US, in your opinion?
I didn't quite understand the question. How is the
Ukraine
Ukraine
fatigue,
party?
yeah, Ukraine fatigue is like in quotation marks signs. That do you believe that the US is kind of, or the US society is kind of tired of this war? You know, it's over 4 months now. They are not
No,
enthusiastic, maybe.
no, I do not believe that the American
Mhm.
people are tired of the war. I believe that it could be accurate that they're tiring of the war. They have a very short attention span with wars, even with wars that the United States is involved with. I think that's another reason why the Biden administration is very reluctant to commit American troops. If you have hundreds and then thousands of bodies coming back in flag draped coffins, caskets to the United States, that is not good for politics whatsoever for an administration in office.
For in Ukraine, but let's go to the second threat or issue, so China. In our interview, you devoted almost the whole space for that, and we see that the Biden administration conducted a series of important international level meetings in this regard. We had Quad summit in Tokyo in May 2022, 1 month ago. We also, 10 or 11th of June, we had Shangri-La summit in Singapore, where Lloyd Austin, US Secretary of Defense, also participated, met with Australian and Japan counterparts, also with his Chinese counterpart. It was their first meeting. So I wanted to ask if you feel, because this is the feeling of many experts in this US foreign policy area, that this Chinese direction of policy, foreign policy, is this leading one, despite the war in Ukraine.
Yes, I think it is, and that's an area that the Democratic Party and the conservative Republicans kind of agree upon, that China is the greater threat than Russia. And I think, in our previous interview of 6 or 8 weeks ago, whatever it was, I had mentioned that some of the alliance in the Pacific Rim was a little bit fragmented. I suspect very strongly that it's coming together, that we're having more of a unified alliance. Possibly that's more the leadership of Australia, for example, than it is of the United States. But I believe that the Pacific Rim alliance is coming together through the behavior of the People's Republic of China, that they do not want to be in a situation where China acts out militarily. China now has a third aircraft carrier, as I understand it, with more on the drawing boards. It takes more than machinery to be a big power. You have to coordinate it. We saw, for example, that several Ukrainian Air Force officers were in Washington a few days ago, where they mentioned how incompetently the Russian military machine is. I do not think that China wants to be assessed in the eyes of the world as being incompetent, even though my guess is, my own belief is, that if China were to be so foolhardy as to engage the Western alliance militarily, that it would look at least as incompetent as the Russian Federation has looked in the eyes of the world in its aggression against Ukraine. So I'm hoping that Xi Jinping, who I think is a much wiser person at the current time than President Putin, I'm hoping that Xi Jinping will not act out and break the status quo in the Pacific Rim in East Asia.
I wanted to ask about this status quo issue, because this was the main topic of this meeting of Lloyd Austin and also his counterpart Wei Feng in Singapore on June 10th. And I wanted to quote a part of the article dedicated to this topic. The Chinese representative expected the US to stop slandering China and interfering in international affairs with the PRC. Don't you think that the goal, which was, of course, kind of building a new relation, maybe establishing some sort of, agreements in many regards, don't you think that it is not possible with China right now?
I don't know that I would believe that anything is impossible. Sometimes the impossible becomes possible. World War II, for example, seemed impossible for the West to win, yet on two fronts, through brilliance of the Roosevelt administration and of General Marshall and of the United States Navy in the Pacific, together with the United Kingdom. So I don't know if it's impossible. We have to be very careful that we do not overreact to the accusations made by Chinese diplomats. Everything is always slanderous. Everything is always about an American hegemony. But I do not believe that they believe that down deep in their hearts. Do they want a reset? I would think they would. If I were they, I certainly would. They do not need to take on the United States at this time. That said, General Austin was a fine four-star general. As a defense secretary, he has some baggage. That baggage is one word: Afghanistan. And when the Chinese look at the American experience in Afghanistan, that could easily embolden them. So my suspicion is that very much like the Russian general staff with Gorbachev at Geneva and then some of them at Reykjavik in the 1980s, that the Chinese invited or agreed to meet with Secretary Austin, former General Austin, because they want to size him up. They want to meet him face to face and take his dimension, take his pulse. And since I believe that he was an effective general, my suspicion is that in person he comes across better than he does in the news media, where he comes across terribly because the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan was grossly incompetent.
Another question to you from the chat. Can the US military might take on both expansionist China and Russia at the same time, or on two fronts simultaneously?
Yes, I believe that the United States of America can do that. It would depend upon the leadership at a given time and their strategic goals. And I'm not familiar with them. I do not receive current intelligence briefings. From what I understand, the belief is that the Russian Federation is a paper tiger. It's a country on the way down, becoming atavistic, as I mentioned in an article written several years ago. China is a country that's rising. There's no question about that. It's not atavistic, but it is, it's not an anachronism, but it is a wishful thinker. And it's not prepared at this point in time, in my opinion, to take on the United States if it were doing that unilaterally. And if it's doing it bilaterally with the Russian Federation, I don't think that makes a significant difference. The United States military is the best in the world. Its capabilities are far greater than the public has any idea of. And I do not worry at all that if these countries, or either of them, or another country, Iran, for example, were to take on the United States, they would be sharply defeated and immediately defeated. The reaction by the American military and by NATO would be immediate and very, very harsh.
Another question, I believe the last one from the chat to you. China is de facto backing Russia in Ukraine. What, if anything, can Washington do to keep China from assisting Russia's aggression in Ukraine? What Washington
I think
can
there are
do?
several. Yeah. Well, first of all, the United States has to walk on a few eggshells because Putin asked Xi to send troops, and Xi declined to do that. China does not want to become involved in a ground war in Ukraine any more than the United States of America does. But more than that, China is banking Russia. There's no question about that. The United States has increased or maintained the tariffs. The Trump tariffs have been maintained by the Biden administration. But you ask, what more could it do? Most of China's bankrolling of Russia is not because it loves Russia so much. It detests Russia. Let's come to the core of that. I've had very close personal friends, high in rank in the Communist Party of China. China detests Russia. It wants Russia's energy reserves. We could destroy pipelines. We could destroy part of those reserves, and we haven't done that because, very sadly, in some ways, the United States itself has been dependent upon Russian energy reserves. If we were to neutralize some of those reserves, and we would not have to neutralize the core reserves, we could neutralize pipelines along the way. We would delay the delivery of Russian energy to China, and I think that would be a significant deterrence to China wanting to spend much more money on Russia. I'm not arguing in that direction. I'm simply saying that there are steps that the United States and the West could take to make Russian energy more poisonous to China than it is.
Another question I will have to you, Professor, regarding this policy right now, US foreign policy in the Far East, is the question about these partners in the Blue Pacific Alliance, let's call it like that. It is a very recent thing. Just 5 days ago, it was signed by the US, Australia, Great Britain, Japan, and New Zealand. And the main goal of this initiative is mostly, let's call it like winning these small Pacific islands from China, or from these tries of China to take over and to rip them apart away from the US. Cooperation with the US and in this regard. So I wanted to ask you if you feel that this kind of partnership, another partnership in the Pacific region, will be successful to cut off these Chinese aspirations.
I think it will be successful. I don't know whether the objective is or should be to cut off any Chinese island relationships that have concretized, but I do think that that this relationship can deter further expansion of China into the Pacific Islands. Let me say this several different points. As you know, I am significantly British by heritage, and I believe the United Kingdom does have and continues to have and will always continue to have that special relationship with the United States that Churchill mentioned in 1944, I think. So we need the United Kingdom very badly. Australia and New Zealand are part of the British Commonwealth, and we need them very badly. And to the extent, we need Canada very badly too, by the way. So to the extent that we have the Blue Pacific relationship concretizing and expanding, I think that's a good thing for the West. I think that's also a good thing for China. Let's make sure we understand here, and I hope if the Chinese operatives are listening, that they understand that a war with the West hurts the Chinese people very, very badly. That when we strike back, they would lose. They don't want that. The alliances in the Pacific Rim help everybody who lives there, as well as the trading partners in the West, the United States, the United Kingdom, the European community. Everybody wins by maintaining the peace, and everybody loses by a major war. I would hope that the smarter minds will prevail in Asia the way they seem not to have prevailed in the Russian Federation.
Yes, let's hope that it will happen. Also, it was the ending, almost the same ending of our interview for the Warsaw Institute Review. The same, actually, the same ending of our talk there. And before we finish, I wanted to ask you, Professor, to encourage our viewers, our readers, to read, to check out our newest, latest quarterly issue, the Warsaw Institute Review, where there is also a very broad interview with you, Professor.
Well, I strongly do urge them to do that. I believe that ordinary people are the key to maintaining the peace. And I've argued for a long time for a new political science master's degree program at American Studies Center, University of Warsaw. That has not happened yet. I believe that that ordinary people in America, in the European theater, in Asia itself, and in Poland, of course, particularly, the more they can learn about the details of these seemingly sometimes frosty relationships, the less frosty they'll become. They'll thaw when people come together to embrace other people.
Professor David Jones, expert in the field of international relations, University of Warsaw, was our guest today. Thank you so much, Professor, for another great and very, very important expertise.
Thank you, Jan. Appreciate it. Anytime.
Thank you.